Hello everyone, we're here today with Natalie Harris and Curtis Stauffer to talk about issues related to advocacy and policy. And we'll start off if each of you will introduce yourself and tell the students a little bit about you and what your agency does.
I'm Natalie Harris. I'm with the Coalition for the Homeless, and we are the Louisville advocacy organization that focuses on homeless and housing issues just in the Jefferson County, Louisville metro area.
I'm Curtis Stauffer. I'm with the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky, and we are a statewide advocacy organization focused on issues of homeless services and affordable housing. Additionally, we provide housing to chronically homeless persons through a statewide voucher program administered through the Continuum of Care, and administer an AmeriCorps Bill Corps program that places service members in homeless service and housing agencies throughout the state of Kentucky.
What do you think are the key policy issues that would impact individuals living in poverty or who are homeless?
I usually tell people that there are two ways that you can address the issue of people being unable to afford housing on a regular basis, because that's the reality. Homelessness is an issue of poverty, so people don't have enough to be able to afford all of their expenses, including their housing, on a monthly basis. And so there are only really two ways to address it. You can help people to increase their income, or you can make housing more affordable. And the world of advocacy has really kind of changed over the last 3 decades that I've been working on this issue. 30 years ago, you would have never gotten anyone to really talk about the income increasing side of things, and everybody was all about increasing affordable housing subsidies and how do we make housing more affordable by getting more vouchers. The world has really changed during that time, and now you're much more likely to hear people talking about increasing minimum wage and trying to find ways to make people's incomes higher. And I think that's just because the disparity of people's incomes has become so huge that now people have to talk about that issue. But it's really an issue of one or the other that you're going to address.
And more importantly, I think, despite the fact that we've become much more progressive in how we're conceptualizing both the causes and impacts of homelessness, poverty, and the lack of affordable housing, is that there just is not enough affordable housing out there. And we're seeing this to the point, because we've seen a total shift since the recession in the dynamics of the housing markets, where there's increasing competition for rental units and not as much demand on home ownership units, whereby even if you have affordable housing vouchers, in some markets it's become increasingly difficult to find housing where you could use your affordable housing resources because the units aren't available or the rents are higher than the fair market rent. So what it really points to as our main advocacy point on a day-to-day level, despite the fact we've made some really innovative approaches in helping people address those economic issues and be more strategic about those. If we don't have the affordable housing to serve the people that need it, especially those that are severely cost burdened, we're going to continue to see people cycling in and out and on the edges of homelessness without providing a real stable base for them to live their lives in comfort and safety.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to talk about the fact that I've never in my life heard anyone say, I'd really like a really nice shelter bed. Mm-hmm. People want affordable housing, and that's what people in all of our communities deserve and need. And so while we work to make emergency housing as nice a situation as possible, really the solution is permanent housing, and we need to advocate so that enough people have that housing. And there are lots of people who want to come up with some kind of this quick answer to solve this advocacy issue of, well, what if we did this little thing? What if we started creating this kind of easy housing or that kind of easy housing? The reality is we are where we are today because our federal government cut housing subsidies by $54 billion a year. And so we're short $54 billion every year, and that compounds every single year.
Yeah, and again, you keep seeing the population of those that are housing cost burdened continue to grow. And one thing that's been really great in terms of the shifts in homelessness policy over the past few years is a focus on housing first and providing permanent supportive housing. But unfortunately, I think we're going to come up in the next few years with this permanency issue. We've put so many people into permanent supportive housing, there are not going to be resources for those folks that need it going forward. Because we have to keep paying for those housing units that are the permanent housing units on a permanent basis. And until we increase the net supply, we're going to run into a wall eventually. And that's where that advocacy for increased funding for affordable housing resources is vital.
If you could make, this is not a question on my list, so I'm surprising you, but if you had the power to make one policy change on the federal level, what would you choose to make that you think would have the biggest impact on folks living in poverty?
I do think that I would say increasing the federal housing subsidies. You could think about ways to increase people's income, but that means you're leaving out a segment of the population that will never be able to work. So because of that, I think that I would probably focus on trying to get us back to the federal housing budget that we had in the 70s.
And even beyond that, one thing we're facing right now is a lot of those projects that were supported in the 70s and 80s through things like project-based Section 8 or the initial round of low-income housing tax credits or home funding when it was first initiated. All those properties are reaching the end of their affordability periods, and it's going to take a whole lot of money just to preserve the housing that's out there right now, much less add additional housing to our pool to meet the growing need for affordable housing units to help us achieve the goals of ending homelessness in this country.
Great. So both of you do a lot of work with advocacy and lobbying on both the local and statewide level. How do you mobilize people to get involved in your efforts to advocate on behalf of your clients?
I think the most important thing is to get people to take the first step. The idea of lobbying sounds so scary to people, and they see it as this big, difficult thing. And so I think it's important to give people little steps that they can take, and also to come up with some way to make it kind of fun or interesting. And so like one of the things we do is we purposefully ask our board members to go with us to meet with their council member. And they don't have to say anything, although most of them do when they get there, because they realize that this is just a person, this is, a neighbor of mine. And once they start having that conversation and they start realizing that they can talk for what they believe in, then they're more willing to go the next time, and then they're eventually willing to go on their own and to make phone calls, and now they have a relationship with this person. But it is all about relationships, so you have to get people to make that first step.
And I think most importantly, when talking about advocacy on policy, especially on a statewide level, you have to give people different ways they can engage. Like you have very simple ways, such as signing a petition online, or adding their name onto an email that'll be sent to a state legislature or state government, or the federal government for that matter, to asking people to directly engage their representatives or state senators, or contact their U.S. representatives or U.S. senators with specific asks. Conversely, you have coalition building, where you're trying to get the different organizations and all their affiliated persons, members, etc., to join with you around a certain organizing issue. So there's different ways you can get people involved, as simple as signing their names on to doing one-on-one advocacy with legislators and government officials. But you have to give them those options and use those easy ways to sort of step people up, as Natalie was saying, to those more dedicated advocacy efforts.
What are some tips you would offer about approaching and engaging legislators about policy issues?
Do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd say it depends on who your audience is. I've been recently working on some federal level advocacy with our U.S. representatives here in the Commonwealth, and you can approach them with much bigger picture ideas, but ultimately they want to know how it affects the people living in their districts. And that same answer goes for people on the local level and the state level as well. So you have to understand who their key constituencies are in their districts, what type of issues there are of concern to their residents. So you can touch base with them on, this is how this specific issue that I'm lobbying around, that might be a national or state level policy, specifically affects people and services in your area. And one thing that's a challenge for us advocating on the federal level is we have a real anti-Washington environment. What so few people realize in this state, that the only source of funding for homeless services, with the exception of a small amount of city funds in a few jurisdictions, is federal money. And when people talk about busting down the Washington budget and making sure that Washington stays out of our business, if Washington stays out of our business, that means our business is out of business. Mm-hmm. So that's a message that I think has been actually quite effective, especially with some of our more conservative members on the U.S. level, on the U.S. Congress level, because they are seeing, if you put it out in front of them, this is what pays for the services that are available to your residents when they get into trouble. It makes them at least a little more cognizant about the impacts of the cuts that they might be proposing as sort of anti-government efforts. And on the state level, it really is about getting a local resident to be part of your lobbying partnership. So you need somebody who's from their district or an agency serving people within their district to go with you, especially if you're working on a broader or statewide level. And that is really your key in the door for a lot of these folks. You can get a meeting being a statewide advocacy organization, but they might just slough it off as a lobbying group. But if you bring in a resident with you and talks about why that issue affects them and why it's important to them as a constituent of the particular government official, it can really make a difference in how much they pay attention to you.
And I think that's one of the hardest things about lobbying on homeless and poverty issues is that, when you're meeting with a legislator or a council member or whoever that may be, a lot of people think, oh, I just need to go and tell this great heartstring story and I'm just going to get this person to vote my way because it's the right thing. And what you have to remember is that the reason why this person holds the seat is because they received votes. They need those votes again if they want that seat again. And they want to create good government for their community. It's not about feeling sorry for one particular person. And so a lot of times they'll say, why am I not getting phone calls about this? If this is such a big issue, where are the constituents that really care about it, and are they going to vote? And so if you're not also working to make sure that you have constituents, the actual people that will be affected by these programs speaking up for themselves, then it's really hard to get somebody to sway to your side. And so I think that's really a hard thing to do when people are just dealing with the day-to-day. You're saying, okay, I know you don't have a place to sleep tonight, but I also need you to go with me and talk to this person about why they need to change the law so you will have a place to stay.
Right. And that's really a big challenge we face in being advocates for the homeless and also other folks working to serve low-income people is low-income people don't have the time to drive an hour and a half from Louisville or Lexington or wherever in the state to go hang out in Frankfurt all day and lobby. Think about the issues that prevent people from accessing their government officials. It's time, it's money, childcare, transportation. These are all things that inhibit our clients and the folks we're advocating for from being able to access safe housing, much less the luxury of having the time to be a lobbyist. So conveying their stories in such a fashion to government officials, especially elected officials, is a real challenge because you have to basically say, unless you can have one of those people that has the time and ability to come with you or has experienced that in the past and has overcome the barriers of poverty and homelessness, at the point where they have the time and freedom to be an advocate, you have to say, trust me, I'm telling you this story and it's true. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't quite mean the same as when Jane Smith comes in and talks about how she was homeless with her kids on the streets of that legislator's hometown. And that's a real challenge for the folks that we're trying to serve because their stories are vitally important, but they're so often overlooked and unheard.
Yeah, and I would say it's important at the same time, even though you do have that disadvantage, to keep meeting with people that you're working with, mm-hmm. legislators, because you will, especially if you do over time bring in their constituents so that they've heard from a constituent, and if you do over time you make sure that you respect that person that you're meeting with on this advocacy level and not do something to embarrass them in front of the press mm-hmm. or make them look bad in front of their constituents, they will begin to trust you. And then when they start to hear something about your issue, they'll call you on the phone and they'll say, hey, I kind of trust you on this issue. This is what I've been told. How would you vote on it? Or have you read it and do you think there's anything I should worry about before I vote that's going to make me look bad? So at the same time that it's really important to have constituents speak, it's also important to continue to meet with people and build up relationships so that you could be seen as an authority as well.
Right, and I think one role that we play as coalition builders in our daily work, but also as advocates, is people can look to us as a resource. So if somebody has a question about homeless policy, and be that a government official or an elected official, and they want to learn more about it and get a better understanding, if they can look to you as a resource where they can expect an honest answer, that puts you in a really powerful position, even if that person might not have the same political alignment with you or the same policy goals you might have, but they learn to trust you as a valid resource for information about programs and their impact.
Great. Can you share an example of a policy change that your agency was involved in that had a positive impact on folks who are homeless or living in poverty?
I would say the two biggest things that I've personally been able to be involved in were both at the state level, and one of those was the state Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and fighting to make sure that we did have additional money to provide housing for low income and homeless people. It's still not enough money, but at least it's much more than we had before. And the second was the expansion of the Medicaid here in Kentucky, and we're the only southern state that did that. And being able to be part of a group that continued to say this is really important, being able to get insurance for all of the poor people in our state, especially a state as poor as Kentucky is, just has made a huge difference here in Kentucky.
Yeah, and I'd say the State Affordable Housing Trust Fund is a real strong example of grassroots advocacy success. It took several of my predecessors in the position, including Natalie, years of advocacy work and coalition building, A, to get the trust fund first established, and B, and much more importantly, get a permanent funding source that's renewable for it, that's been a really valuable tool to leverage federal monies to build affordable housing in the Commonwealth and throughout the Commonwealth. And that really emerged from a coalition of advocates from across the state that started talking in the early 1990s that we need to build this resource. And it took them years of work and lobbying and coalition building before it was finally passed in the mid-2000s. So that, I think, is a real highlight of grassroots advocacy success. But at the same point, we can see on a smaller grassroots scale, building coalitions around new issues, and even just getting bills introduced is an important success. Like, for example, this past year, in coalition with some advocates based in Bowling Green who had been working on the community level there, we got a bill introduced to make the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act in effect statewide. And this has been a goal of housing advocates both on the for-profit and nonprofit side for over 20 years, actually 30 years at this point. And the fact that we were able to get it back on the legislative radar just by getting a bill introduced, I consider to be a big advocacy success, and it gives us opportunity to build on that and move forward over the next couple of years.
And there are also issues that you can work on that are not necessarily legislative, and it's kind of nice to have those in your pocket because they can be won a little easier, especially if you can get a relationship with people who run your local government, whether that be your city staff or the state employees that run programs. And an example of that is this past year we've been working with the state to change a policy so it doesn't have to go through legislation that will allow them to, when somebody is incarcerated, at this point what happens is when they leave jail, they've lost their Medicaid. So they have to go all the way back through the process, reapply, and work to get their Medicaid again. Whereas what could happen, and many other states have done, is just to terminate that. So we've worked with the state and they've already sent letters saying, yes, we are going to make that change. And that's all it took, was enough people writing enough letters and going to meet with the right people at the state to make that happen.
And similarly, in a prior life, I worked with Metropolitan Housing Coalition, which is a housing policy advocacy organization that serves the Metro Louisville area. And one of the successes they had over the years was intervening with the Public Services Commission when the local utility wished to do rate increases and also change how they spend what they call their demand side management program, which is funds that are generally targeted to reduce energy usage. And through that process, in partnership with other advocates, we were able to negotiate substantially increased funding resources for programs that specifically target low-income households. So it's those administrative areas that Natalie was talking about where you can also make a real difference if you're strategic about building coalitions and understand and monitor when public comment is sought and when you have a chance to make input on policy decisions. So even, for example, on the local level, every year, if your city receives HUD money through Community Development Block Grant or HOME or HOPWA or Emergency Solutions Grant, they have to do an annual plan, and they're required to have an annual comment period. If you, as an advocate or a social worker working in the field, have the opportunity to speak about the policy issues that are funded by those programs that are important to you, take advantage of those opportunities to make public comment because they do have an effect on policy, and unfortunately too few people participate in that process. So your voice is even louder if you take the time to participate.
You kind of hit on this a little bit, Curtis, but what role do you think social workers play in advocacy, and how can they get involved?
They can play a number of roles. I think, as I mentioned earlier, talking about the challenges that low-income and homeless folks have participating in the political system, if you're a line level social worker and you're working with your clients every day to help them address their issues and you're hearing their stories and you feel for their stories, you as that social worker, because it's a personal interaction for you, can be a really powerful voice for conveying the issues that your clients are facing to government and elected officials. If we can't get the people that are actually living through the system and experiencing the shortfalls and challenges that we face through policy decisions that are made every day, the folks that are trying to serve them are very powerful conveyors of that. On the flip side of that, from that real micro level, you can also take a more meta level view about your experience, A, working in the system, or B, from your expertise generated by looking at policy and identifying where there are policy areas that need improvement or policy barriers to serving people. So if you can combine, as a social worker, both those meta and micro views, it takes a really powerful advocacy voice.
And I think a lot of people who are case managers think, well, I can't get involved in the political system because it's political and my agency won't agree with that. I think it is important not to take a side, to not say, oh, vote for this person or vote for that person. But at the same time, it's really important to allow homeless people and poor people to have their own rights to vote, and to remind people how important it is to take them to fill out their voter's card and to remind them to go and vote without telling them who. And even to give people the opportunity to know about, there's a candidates forum to go and listen so you can decide yourself, how you feel about this person. It's really hard to get engaged and get excited about voting if you have no idea who any of the candidates are. And so, whatever you can do to help educate people to make their own decisions, I think will make them more active in their own political lives.
And again, if you have the opportunity as a social worker case manager to participate in the political system, be that, again, commenting on your city's annual action plan or your state's annual action plan, or looking at local issues that affect how services are provided. So for example, a few years ago here in Louisville, and in Lexington this is occurring right now, there was no zoning that allowed homeless shelters. And it was through advocacy of housing advocates and homeless service providers that, through negotiation and the threat of a lawsuit against the city for a fair housing violation, that ultimately homeless shelter zoning and regulatory system was enacted that I would say people have been fairly happy with as it's been implemented. And Lexington is dealing with this issue right now. And again, a HUD lawsuit has proved the impetus to it, but by having the opportunity to advocate for these sort of micro level issues when they arise, it's a really important way to achieve better outcomes for the system as a whole and for your clients in particular. Another opportunity that's still ongoing here in Louisville, despite the fact that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund was passed into law in 2008, it still remains unfunded. And there's been years and years and years of advocacy that's continued and ongoing. And so if you have a chance to go before your city council and speak about this issue from your perspective as a case manager about how it will benefit your work and your clients and enable the system to work better, that's sort of a nonpartisan way of being a policy advocate, and it's a really important role that social workers can play because your experience speaks a lot to how these things work on the ground and provides a real face and a real picture for the impact of these policy decisions.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for taking the time to speak to the students today. Anything you want to add before we close up?
No, I just encourage everyone to get involved at some level. It's important to do the direct service work and to do that every day. But if you don't have some way of getting involved with the policies around you, I think it's hard to keep from getting lost in that and maybe depressed about the world that you see around you. And if you can get involved in making change, I think it also helps you to do the daily work that you have to do.
And one thing I'd encourage everybody to do if you have a chance, and this is a real easy step, is search online, find national advocacy organizations around homeless and housing issues. Just sign up for their listserv because you get email alerts about advocacy opportunities. Similarly, get on your state advocacy agency listservs or your local listservs with your local partners. So that way you can be alerted about when opportunities for participation in the system and advocacy events and or opportunities to provide statement arise. So that's a real easy way to stay in the loop without putting a lot of effort into it.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you.